This is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of June 25th, 2018. And let me start out by saying spoilers ahead. If you have not seen the season finale of Westworld, please listen to this podcast some other time after you've seen it, because I don't want to inadvertently spoil you, and I have a feeling the way that I need to talk about stuff, there's practically no way of getting around spoiling you. So, that having been said, let's begin. It's way too early for me to decide whether or not I actually like the season finale of Westworld, and as a matter of fact, I've committed to rewatching the entire series in perhaps a more compressed time frame now that I know how it ends. And I think that that represents a very interesting change in the way we watch television. And as a matter of fact, the way that we've watched television has changed so much in the last 15 years. I thought I would back up a little bit and explain how we got to this point. Believe it or not, it was the DVD that ushered in a new wave of television watching. You might recall, or you might not, that it was shows like 24 that got a second life on DVD. It was, you would rent the entire season of 24 after not really having watched it the whole year, and as such, you get a whole different perspective on it from watching it all at one time. You didn't have these long waits, and you could really get caught up on what was going on and really focus on details because they seemed very fresh. DVDs as a binge-watching medium had a relatively short life, of course, since on-demand and DVRs took over from where DVDs left off. The big problem with DVDs, of course, was going to the Blockbuster Video and finding that the next one that you needed wasn't available, and nobody liked that. That created all sorts of problems, and then you would go and you would try to rent the entire season, and somebody else would complain, and what have you. Sort of the next revolution in binge watching came with Lost, especially getting into the second and third seasons of Lost, because it became more of a shared experience. You would go on the internet, you would try to learn the stuff that you had not seen, try to understand what you had seen, and then you'd go ahead and discuss it. This was great because it meant that you could have an extremely complex form of storytelling that, as a group, the entire country could come to understand together. And that is about where things sat in the state of binge watching for about maybe 5 or 6 years. The next, shall we say, advancement in binge watching came when we all got streaming Netflix and other on-demand, what they call subscription video on-demand services, because then you could go back to shows that people had been talking about for years, and you could really begin to pick them up, and you found that you got a different experience. Not only did you watch in a much more compressed time frame, which meant that you could really kind of understand what was going on, but there was also all this material out on the internet that let you get caught up very quickly. There were things like IMDb, which I contend that Game of Thrones would never exist without IMDb, because you simply have no idea otherwise who half of these people are. And that also enabled shows to get a whole new audience. It was around this time that a lot of people picked up on Breaking Bad, which was not a very well-received show in its first 2 or 3 seasons, but all of a sudden, by the time that you got close to the end, everybody was talking about it because they were able to get caught up using Netflix. And so, that brings you to today, where we have gotten to a whole new level of binge watching, and I think that Westworld brings something new to the table that has never been seen before. And even if the show flames out, crashes and burns, and doesn't really deliver on the promise that it had, I think that it will be remembered for taking binge watching as an art to a whole other level. Let me explain what I mean, because it's been 4 minutes already, and I've been yammering on about this sort of thing. The thing about Westworld that's unique is that you can gain so much more from a second watching. It's so deliberately convoluted and confusing that you almost have to know the ending before you begin. You can only do this, of course, by watching twice. Watch once to get surprised as everybody is getting surprised, and then watch again, and certain things will just make a whole other level of sense. I mean, for example, last season, at the end of season 1, it was said that, okay, well, it was revealed we have multiple timelines. It's not all taking place in the same timeline. And the young William was, in fact, the Men in Black character. So if you go back and rewatch season 1 and you know that, then all of a sudden certain things make sense that didn't make sense before you. Oh, okay, that's what they're saying. That's what they're meaning. And maybe you just ignored that as something that you didn't have to worry about the first viewing, and then the second viewing it made a whole lot of sense. Now, season 2 is over, and I've made some time, hopefully, to rewatch it all in 1 to 2 days in the coming weeks. And the goal is to try to look back and say, okay, well, the big shock of this season, I guess, was that, two big shocks. First of all, that Dolores wasn't really fine-tuning Bernard in the past, that Dolores was fine-tuning Bernard in the very, very present or even future, that being one. And the second was that throughout any part of the timeline where it took place after Bernard washed up on the shore, that it wasn't really Charlotte Hale, that it was really Dolores in sort of Charlotte clothes. And it makes me wonder if I'm going to find a lot of dialogue that makes a lot more sense now that I just simply dismissed, because there's so much going on and you have to kind of dismiss it. And maybe it will make me more tolerant of some of the standalone episodes. You know, everybody talks about how the standalone episode with Delos and the standalone episode with Akachita were the two best episodes of the season. I disagree, because they seemed like unnecessary distractions to me when I watched them. I felt a show that's only got 10 hours of television to offer you has got to be a little bit more focused and not go off on these long flights of fancy. The same thing with Shogun World. I felt like a lot of what happened at Shogun World was just an unnecessary repetition designed to drive home the fact that a lot of these characters, a lot of these host characters, were programmed and that their motivations were not their own. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to look very critically at what ends up being about half the season, because you spend about half the season between Shogun World, Akachita, and Delos to try to, and was that really necessary, or did it just take away 5 hours away from what should have been a much more engaging story? If I remember, I will report back to you, but the whole point is that this is something that Westworld has ushered in, that you've never really seen that before, that level of understanding necessary to go back and you have to watch it twice. You have to see what was going on, and then it makes sense. I guess you could say that Game of Thrones kind of had that to some degree from my understanding of it, but that there's also so much going on in Game of Thrones that you're just constantly referring to reference works. So it wasn't as obvious, especially, Game of Thrones is already several more seasons through, and there's so much more background material that you have to deal with. Westworld is a standalone thing. It didn't come from books, and yes, it was based on a movie, but only very loosely. So you're really just going to be focusing a lot more on the television that you're watching. Anyway, I have gone way, way, way long on this particular podcast, and for that I apologize, but it's an interesting topic because I think we're seeing, just as Westworld gives us a new evolution in the idea of humanity, Westworld, the show, gives us a new evolution in the idea of TV watching. And I thought that was worth a few extra minutes. I hope you did too. In the meantime, you all have a great week, and I will talk to you with a more normal-sized podcast next time.